The war in Ukraine has now been going on for so long that we can start to look for lessons about modern war in general. Recently, the Royal United Services Institute, perhaps better known as RUSI, issued a report where they look at the early phases of the war. So that is the period from February until July, when Russia was still on the offensive and gaining territory. And they have some pretty interesting observations about what we can learn from the war about war in general. So that is what I want to go through in this video. RUSI's report is a very interesting narrative about the early phases of the war. There are some insightful observations about the Russian plan and how Ukraine managed to sort of organize the initial defense. So if you're interested in those sorts of things about this war in particular, I recommend you read the whole report. But what I want to go through and talk about in this video is the last part of RUSI's report, where they discuss 5 lessons about war in general. RUSI describes it as lessons for the British military because that is their primary stakeholder, but it doesn't take a lot of abstraction sort of to apply the same lessons to all militaries. The first lesson is that distance does not create a sanctuary in modern warfare. This is the observation that missiles and drones have so big a range that no matter how far from the front lines you are, you can still get hit. Of course, there is a limit, but these weapons have a range of thousands of kilometers. So in practice, distance does not provide safety. We should also not assume that the enemy doesn't have good intelligence systems. The Ukrainian experience is actually that Russia has some very good so-called human capabilities. So that is human intelligence, or basically people willing to give information to the Russians about the location of the Ukrainian forces. What the Russians have been missing is the capability to process that information quickly enough to get to hit the targets before they move again. So often the Ukrainians have seen Russia sending missiles at places where something important used to be before it moved. But important targets that are stationary, they will get hit. The consequences of that are big. It challenges the notion of having a safe staging area where you can prepare your forces for battle and have maintenance facilities and air bases and those sorts of things, because all that is going to get hit if it doesn't move around. So you can't have big permanent structures. So, for example, your Air Force has to have the ability to disperse and operate from many different locations. So this way your enemy won't know where your planes are, and if they do find them, then they're not all in the same place. So you have to increase the survivability by all the time moving your things around and not having your assets concentrated in the same location. And the same goes for stockpiles of ammunition and maintenance facilities. So everything related to logistics and maintenance just is a lot harder because you can't have big warehouses or build big cities of tents and stuff like that. But perhaps even more challenging, what this means is that you also can't have very centralized command and control structures. So you can't, for example, build computer systems with centralized data centers that rely on a few very important pieces of critical infrastructure, because all that is going to be destroyed. And also, you can't have staffs working in centralized locations. Like military staffs can be pretty big at the divisional level. We're talking about hundreds of people with all kinds of support equipment as well. And you just can't have all these people staying in the same place because it's way too vulnerable. So the staffs have to operate from the same principles of being dispersed and constantly moving around. So there are lots of challenges that come from this first lesson, that there is no sanctuary in modern warfare. The second lesson is that warfighting requires significant slack capacity. There is perhaps an exception with the United States, but definitely all the European NATO countries just have too small stockpiles of weapons. RUSI notes that at the peak of the artillery war in the spring, Russia was using more ammunition in 2 days than Britain's entire military has in stock. And the reason why Ukraine has managed to handle the invasion is that they had bigger capacity than the European NATO countries. Ukraine used less artillery than Russia, but RUSI estimates that at the Ukrainian rate of consumption, the British stockpiles would have lasted about a week. And then they go on to saying that in reality, it probably would have lasted longer for Britain because Ukraine had 10 times as much artillery as Britain when the war started. So Britain wouldn't have been able to consume that much ammunition in just 1 week. So the point is that when there is a big war, then the consumption is just enormous. You will need stockpiles of all types of ammunition and spare parts. And you also need the industry to have the capacity to produce more ammunition during the war. I think an interesting observation that RUSI makes is that we also need to consider whether there is a sort of point of diminishing returns with technology, because the most sophisticated weapons are really good, but if the production time is long, then perhaps it would have been better to have bigger quantities of something that is less sophisticated. Another interesting observation that RUSI makes is that you also need to have spare capacity of people. So, for example, it's not enough to just have spare parts for your equipment. You also need to have people with specialist skills to use it. But you also need to have training capacity for a wartime situation. So this is interesting because it means that training capacity, in some sense, actually becomes an operational capacity in itself. So there is a bit of a blurring line between the two. And this is interesting because when you look at the way some European militaries have managed all those years where their budgets were getting smaller, then many of them sacrificed their training capacity. For example, and I know this might sound hard to believe, but in Denmark, where I come from, then just a few years ago, the big mantra in the military was on-the-job training. Well, it turns out that on-the-job training is not actually what you want during a war. Instead, what you need is to have the capacity to train more soldiers when the war breaks out so that you can increase the size of your military. And you want to be able to do that without having to pull back soldiers from the front line to work as instructors. RUSI's third point is that unmanned aerial systems are extremely important, so they must be available everywhere. This is what most people call drones, and it's probably not the most surprising lesson. I think drones is probably the one thing that most people would mention from the top of their head as a lesson from this war. But it does have some important implications because if drones are so important that they must be available everywhere, then it means that there has to be a very sort of decentralized control over those drones. And that creates some challenges about airspace safety, for example. So if you have manned aircraft and helicopters flying around in the same area where ground units are sending up drones, then that obviously can be a hazard. But RUSI's point is that we somehow need to fix that problem in a way where the solution is not to just prohibit the use of drones. And then, of course, we also need to have counter UAV systems everywhere because we should also expect the enemy to have drones. So that means that we need to find cheap ways to destroy the drones of the enemy because we can't use expensive air defense weapons to shoot down cheap drones. We have to find a cost-effective way to deal with that so it doesn't drain all our resources. An important way to do that is probably going to be electronic warfare. But as RUSI points out, then that also challenges our current sort of force composition because electronic warfare is hard and it requires specialist knowledge. So in the West, that has traditionally been organized in a few specialist units. but somehow we need to get that capability integrated more on the lower levels. And speaking of electronic warfare, then that is actually lesson number 4. There is a lot of electronic warfare going on in Ukraine, much more than most people realize. And the experience is that the way this plays out is that there is a lot of interference and disruption, but there is not a lot of permanent denial of the electromagnetic spectrum. So there are many time-limited disruptions, and forces have to deal with that constantly. And the reason why we aren't seeing more permanent denial is that both sides all the time need to balance their desire to disturb the adversary against their own need to use the electromagnetic spectrum. So they can set up a jammer and disturb the adversary for some time, but eventually they have to turn off the jammer because they want to use those frequencies themselves. This could be because they want to launch some drones, for example, that require a GPS signal, or they want to use radio communication. So what this means is that there is a constant fight over the electromagnetic spectrum, but this could just as well be framed as a fight for precision, because to a large extent, that is exactly what the electromagnetic spectrum provides. If you can have a drone to guide your artillery, then it will be more precise. If you're able to communicate, then your forces can coordinate. So if you can win the electronic war, then you will have greater precision than your enemy, because you can constantly blur his situational awareness and interrupt his kill chain, while you yourself can have the benefits of speed and precision. In Ukraine, they have discovered that electronic warfare is pretty difficult to coordinate. To begin with, they had a very decentralized approach where electronic warfare capabilities were sort of distributed among other units, but it didn't really work. It turned out that normal units did not have the sufficient knowledge about how to use electronic warfare, so they weren't able to use it properly. So instead, Ukraine now has a more centralized organization, and they sort of have a more centralized coordination of the electronic warfare. But all the time, this has also to be synchronized with the maneuvers of the other units so that they provide the right effects at the right time. An interesting thing about electronic warfare is that there is also very much, it's also very much about pattern recognition of how the other side operates. Because that can sort of give you indications about what they're about to be doing. For example, if the enemy has been jamming navigation systems for a long time, but then they suddenly stop, then that may indicate that they're about to sort of launch a drone, maybe, and that there could be an artillery strike coming. So there is a kind of cat and mouse kind of game going on there in the electromagnetic spectrum. But if you can take out some of the enemy's electronic warfare capabilities, then that is an important target, because it means that you will improve the precision of your own weapons over time and degrade the quality of the enemy's systems. The final lesson is that dispersal and movement is the key to survival on the front line. And if you need to be stationary, then you need a hardened cover. Ukraine has found that hardened covers work well. But if you can't stay under hard cover, then your forces must be dispersed and constantly moving around. To some extent, this is similar to the first lesson, but the difference is that here we're talking about units on the front line, so the speed and the scale is different. For example, a Ukrainian infantry company, so that's a pretty small unit, maybe 150 soldiers, they typically have to spread out across 3 kilometers. And this increases the survivability, because then the enemy can't hit them all at the same time because they're not in the same place. But then they also have to move. They do that to challenge the enemy's kill chain. A kill chain is basically all those procedures that you have to go through before you can fire at something. So when the enemy discovers you, for example, with a drone, And then that information has to be transmitted through the system, and somebody has to make a decision, and that has to be turned into targeting data for the artillery. And that takes some time. When you talk about breaking the enemy's kill chain, then what that means is basically that you disturb that process. So in this case, it can mean that you move before the enemy gets through his bureaucracy, so that when the artillery actually comes, then you're not there anymore. Another expression for the same thing is to get inside his OODA loop. It basically means to make decisions faster than he can, so eventually you will have him running around in circles. But okay, dispersal and movement is important if you want to survive on the front line, and that gives huge command and control challenges for the units, because it's really hard to coordinate the actions when your unit is dispersed and moving around, especially when the different parts of your unit begin to pass through each other. Then it gives huge challenges, for example, with friend and foe identification. So there is a risk of friendly fire. So there is a big need for different tools that can improve command and control at that level. Okay, so that was the 5 lessons about war that RUSI has mentioned in their report. I think it's interesting that we are starting to see these more substantial collections of experiences coming out from the Ukraine war, because until now, much of this has been very anecdotal, and it's hard to make broad conclusions on that. And certainly we are going to see a lot more like this coming out, but I think RUSI's points here are both relevant and interesting. And then we can, of course, get into an argument about how much of this is actually new and how much is basically just old stuff that we're discovering again, but that's a discussion for another time. If you found this video useful, please give it a like, and also remember to subscribe to the channel and press the bell icon to get notifications when I upload new videos. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again next time.